Previously on the best sword-fighting films of all time, number 1. But wait, that's 2 films. You can't. Shut up, you fool! And now, the conclusion. And so we come to the first of the 15 or so fights within the 2 films. I say 15 or so because the way I've cut together the last fight scene / 2 fight scenes has been a little arbitrary, but I've basically split it into an inside the nunnery and outside the nunnery section. But we shall return to that at the appropriate time. The first fight scene starts in the title sequence, and once again these 2 films are packed full of fights, and so I'll do my best to get through them as quickly as possible.
I'd only use it as a last resort, when all else has failed.
And so the scene starts with a glorious close-up of an incredibly detailed and accurate early 17th century rapier. I say early 17th century because The Three Musketeers is set in 1625 initially. Something which is already apparent in this fight scene, although it becomes more clear in the second fight scene, is that Bill Hobbs gives each character an appropriate style. Not only is D'Artagnan's style wild and erratic because of his youth, but his style is also unorthodox, which is again made evident in the second fight by the incredulous looks that the other musketeers give whenever they see D'Artagnan in the fray. The reason for his unorthodox style is also shown subtly in the first fight scene. His training with the rapier has most probably been entirely with his father, who himself has a somewhat idiosyncratic style with little quirks and tricks up his sleeve. The other musketeers we see later are almost certainly from slightly wealthier backgrounds and therefore probably received more formal training earlier, as well as the further training they would receive once in the service of the king. And so it seems appropriate now to look at Fight 2, where we see all the musketeers fighting together against the Cardinal's guards.
What is your name, youngster?
D'Artagnan.
Well then, Athos, Porthos, Aramis, and D'Artagnan. Forward! First, let us pray. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. May I? sake, sir! Down! Thank you. D'Artagnan! No! No! Leave him to me! Put down your sword, sir! No. What? Surrender, Biscari. I order you. Oh, that's different.
This scene best highlights Bill Hobbs' incredible skill in crafting styles for the characters appropriate to those characters. D'Artagnan dashes here and there, full of energy and enthusiasm, losing his sword early on because of his inexperience and recklessness, and having to pick up new weapons left, right, and center. But somehow he's never daunted for very long by any minor setbacks, such as losing his own rapier, and eagerly rushes to help his friends whenever he can, even perhaps when he's not even needed. Athos' style is a very subtle portrayal of his character. There is a lot of anger in his fighting and aggression, but it is not uncontrolled, and he is clearly wary of his opponent, but when he seizes opportunity, attacks with an almost animal ferocity, and yet still he is in control. Obviously in this fight he's also laboring with an injured right arm, and for whatever reason he is fencing with his right arm while using his cloak and his left arm as a further weapon/defense tool. Porthos uses his strength and bluster to intimidate and batter his opponent, and he will use anything that comes to hand, not just his sword. In fact, most of the hits he lands are usually with something else like a rock or a stick. And finally we have Aramis, who is cunning, tricky, clever in his fighting, quite technical, and also clearly very much aware of the distance between himself and his opponent, and he plays with his opponents because he has a superior understanding of their relative distance. However, that does literally in some cases lead him to trip up because he is slightly overconfident in his increased skill and spatial awareness. We also see here the first instance of what might be an idiosyncratic feature of Bill Hobbs' fight choreography, where Aramis uses the soggy end, as it were, of his rapier. In this case, I mean, he's hitting with the handle and the guard of his rapier to knock the opponent's blade out of the way. This seems very odd to my eye, and it's not the only time that it happens in fight scenes, as you will see further on in this video. Now, I am not an expert in rapier fencing. I'm not a rapier fight reenactment buff. I'm not a HEMA fiend. I have read the odd bit bit of the old Renaissance technical manuals like George de Silva's and bits of other fencing manuals from time to time, but I've not, in an academic fashion, methodically memorized and studied all of these Renaissance texts. This is not something I am particularly inspired to do. I'm interested in swordplay. I like using swords, but I don't particularly want to do reenacting of something with a weapon without the intention of it being used for its ultimate purpose, which is hitting your opponent with a view to injuring or killing them. Now, the way I do that in the sport of fencing, of course, is not to actually injure or kill them, but the point is meant to hit the opponent with the pressure necessary to enter the opponent. Otherwise, the point should not register. Conversely, in the admittedly limited interaction I've had with fight reenactment aficionados, they are often somewhat pompous, bizarrely dressed, and this is when they come fencing as well. So they will arrive wearing bizarre and inappropriate looking equipment to fence in, and invariably they are naff fencers with stilted and unnatural and non-flowing actions, and normally get their asses handed to them, to use the vernacular. Whereas on the fencing circuit, I don't know of many people in the top ranks of fencing who also go in for HEMA and fencing reenactment. I mean, it is, as I was essentially highlighting just now, comparing acting with doing. With the reenactments, your aim is to perform a dance. In fact, the fight reenactments with the rapier and older swords is more like Morris dancing than fencing, whereas fencing is a combat sport. The idea is to hit your opponent with the point of the weapon. For all fencing's potential grace, beauty, and fluidity, fencers are essentially graceful, beautiful, fluid, maimers and killers in fundamental purpose, even if not in actuality. I imagine hitting your opponent with the point of the weapon is somewhat frowned upon in medieval and Renaissance fight reenactments. However, Bill Hobbs doesn't quite fit into this category. To be fair, he was not a HEMA buff or a fight reenactment buff for the purposes of the discussions in this video. He is a fight choreographer, and yes, he is literally putting swordplay into acting, and they are acting fights and they will not hit each other. But Bill was a very good fencer. He does not fit into the category of the stilted, awkward, buffoonish fight reenactors who occasionally come fencing and look as natural as a goldfish in a privet hedge. Bill did have a fluidity and natural fencing gift, which also translates into his fight choreography because he knows how real fighters move. And so I am not going to quibble or question Bill's use of people hitting opponents or opponents' weapons with the handle of the rapier in his fight choreography, because I just don't have his level of knowledge, and I will always bow to his superior experience and skills in this area. Fight 3 is where the Duke of Buckingham, having just completed his secret assignation with Queen Anne, is surprised and set upon by agents of Cardinal Richelieu. This scene, perhaps more than the last one, is an exercise by the director and fight choreographer to make use of the setting more than a technical sword fighting or fencing exercise. The unusual scene of a fight inside the laundry is played for some laughs and just some bizarre imagery. One thing you might notice from this fight, which may not have been as obvious in the last fight, is that Athos always seems to enter a fight by throwing his hat away. In this case, he throws it into Planchet, but in other ones, he'll just fling it into the air. This is something to watch out for in all the subsequent fight scenes as well. Finally, the fight scene is set up to end with a beautifully and very obviously staged set piece where all the fighters, one by one, end up lined up opposite the one remaining opponent, who in the end just collapses from exhaustion. The fourth fight, being the food fight, is definitely more of an exercise in spectacle rather than in sword fighting itself.
You great overgrown child! Why, you pig! You fat swine! Overdressed popinjay! You lost it! Come here! Come back, you rabbit! I know what you're doing. Oi! Oi! Oh! All right?
This should cover the inconvenient sound.
What's going on?
Indeed, having watched this carefully choreographed act of thievery, one might fairly say this is indeed more like Morris dancing than actual sword fighting. The intent, of course, never to hit one another, merely to spear as many food items as possible in order to sneakily spirit them away. But arguably, it is far more energetic and entertaining than that particular form of dance. And with Fight 5, we at last reach Bill Hobbs' cameo fight, which of course anyone who's seen the prelude to this series will of course already know very well.
Oh, you're drunk, sir.
There's only one answer for that. You will pay for it now, sir, if you please.
This is sheer folly. Kill the fellow and follow us as soon as you can, will you?
Come on.
Already down to 3.
Well, Porpoise is safe enough. The fellow's drunk.
He looked sober enough when he came on guard. Daniel, look. Ruin.
Here we see Bill doing two-handed fencing. Now, while I have to some degree mastered left-handed fencing, and of course am naturally a right-handed fencer, I've yet to attempt to pull these two skills together into two-handed fencing. I am toying with the idea of making a body wire with two ends, which would be very easy to do, and this may be something I might do just for, fun, giggles, laughs. In a similar vein, I've been toying with the idea of making a bridge for two reels so that I could fence two opponents at once, with or without two swords in my own hand. I mean, one sword at least in one hand, but you know what I mean. Bill is very much leading the fight, as you might expect, because, well, he is the fight choreographer, but also, ultimately, his character beats Porthos, and so it is absolutely in character that he should seem in control or to have, to some degree, the upper hand in this fight. Fight 6 is the second fight to occur on the Three Musketeers plus D'Artagnan's journey from Paris to England in order to recover the two diamond studs that Queen Anne gave to the Duke of Buckingham as a keepsake.
Get away! Right out! Come on! Come on! Come on! Come on. Drop it.
In the previous fight, Porthos was taken out. In this fight, both Athos and Aramis are removed from the mission, possibly fatally, as far as D'Artagnan can discern. Once again in this fight, we see Athos throwing his hat. Athos clearly has the upper hand in his fight. His assailant is some cheap ruffian who may have a sword but doesn't really know how to use it very well. And all seems to be going well for Athos up until the point where his cloak gets snagged in the water wheel. At this point, I imagine Athos wishes he'd chucked his cloak as well as, or instead of, his hat. Should be noted here also, Richard Lester really loves to show the folly of throwing yourself through the air at your opponent. This happens multiple times through the films. In fact, near the beginning of The Three Musketeers, D'Artagnan swings on a rope to try and hit Rochefort and of course misses to hilarious effect. This is a running theme or running gag throughout both films. Fight 7 is the night fight between Rochefort and D'Artagnan in the woods somewhere near Calais. After D'Artagnan discovers that all access to ships leaving Calais requires papers signed by the Cardinal, and he also, while spying on Rochefort, sees that he has these very same papers and needs to steal them.
Where are your three accomplices? They would have done better to...
It's me! It's
It's me. It's me. Don't worry, sir. I'm coming. Yeah. Ow! Coming. I told you.
It's quite interesting to see a fight at night in the age before electric torches. That said, it's difficult to imagine oil lamps being flung around in the manner that they are in this fight without either 1. Everyone and everything being on fire very quickly, or 2. Everyone being in darkness very quickly as they go out. After D'Artagnan attempts the secret thrust that his father taught him, and this almost ends up with him being fatally wounded, it's nice to see Planchet, albeit comedically, save him from Rochefort in the end. Fights 8 and 9 in the film are essentially the same fight, but broken in the film by some scenes inside the palace, and broken in terms of fights by the first half being entirely D'Artagnan on his own fending off the Cardinal's guards, who are attempting to stop him, returning the 2 diamond studs to Madame Bonacieux, who's up on the balcony, desperately trying to catch them every time he throws them, while the second half of the fight, which I am calling Fight 9, involves not only Planchet, but the 3 musketeers coming to the rescue.
Constance, I'm almost there.
Man, yeah, come on. Come on, come down. Come down. Down.
Oh! Way out! Oh, sorry.
In this first fight, we see a concealed dagger being discovered, essentially by D'Artagnan, in the handle of his rapier, just in time to get him out of a sticky situation. His unfamiliarity, of course, being because this rapier is the gift from Buckingham, and he probably didn't realise it had this additional feature. This fight also features some nice glove parrying from D'Artagnan, perhaps more so than we've seen in previous fights. And at the end of this fight, de Jussac arrives, and D'Artagnan acknowledges him as a more worthy and serious opponent with a nod of recognition. Fight 9, as I mentioned, is the second half of this sequence where all looks lost for D'Artagnan and de Jussac looks about to run him through while he's pinned to the door when help finally arrives.
Guards, after him! Follow that bear! Hey! Hey! Ah! Jack! My old friend! There you are, young man, to the rescue, eh? Thank God you're all alive. Well done. Oh, marvelous to see you. How good to see you. Can you get me up there, please?
The first help to arrive is Planchet, dressed as a polar bear, and while distracting the guards, he is able to open the gate and allow in the three musketeers, all of whom are, of course, injured through their various encounters on their way to Calais previously. Once again, Athos flings his hat away, and unusually for Athos, most of the fight he conducts with a large branch. Perhaps this is explained by now numerous injuries he's picked up throughout this adventure so far. Fight number 10 is very brief, since it involves simply Madame Bonacieux being kidnapped and D'Artagnan's failed attempt to prevent this.
Stand up and fight, you coward!
There's a very short sword exchange between D'Artagnan and a ruffian. Then Rochefort steps in, unfortunately onto a bowl of grapes, slipping, which allows D'Artagnan to wound him on the hand. But then a ruffian takes out D'Artagnan and buries him in potatoes. Fight 11 is a practice scene, predominantly, involving Aramis and Porthos.
But where? Where? You say they kidnapped her? Under your very nose? A mere 4 of them?
To lose one's mistress in the conventional way is bad enough. But to have her carried off like a basket of washing, my dear D'Artagnan, that's careless, almost bad taste, huh, Porthos?
Especially when one has since begun paying attention to a beautiful, great milady of the court. Your poor Madame Bonancieux will probably prefer to stay with her kidnappers. My mistresses would if I treated them so. Aramis! Aramis! Observe my new trick of tension. Now, my opponent is there, about to unsheath, when suddenly... Ah! Ah!
Oh, Porthos. Try it again.
Right.
Only Porthos could invent a new way of disarming himself. Will you never learn, you great oaf?
Stop it, kidnapper, why?
Not even listening.
Stop messing about! This is the sign!
Here we see an intricate mechanical device being pumped by some poor servant in order to offer Aramis some sort of challenge with various weapons thrusting at him from different positions. I must confess, this fencing device is far cooler than my much more static and limited fencing device. Then we see what must now be called, I think, the Porthos maneuver, where he proudly demonstrates his ability to hit an opponent by flinging his sword away, and Aramis then quickly demonstrates why this was a stupid idea. In Fight 12, we find D'Artagnan has just slept with Milady de Winter, in spite of the fact that he knows that she is behind or part of the conspiracy to abduct Madame Bonacieux, his lover, and in fact, arguably he has deliberately slept with her in order that she is then vulnerable and he can wring the information as to Bonacieux's whereabouts out of her. However, Milady is not to be trifled with.
Where is Constance Bonacieux?
Quickly! Unless you want this bed to be your deathbed, where is she?
Wait.
Try that again, and I'll cut some fleur-de-lis on the rest of you.
And so in the fight we see acid daggers being used and one sword. It's not really a fair sword fight, although D'Artagnan does take his time getting to his sword. Plus, the acid daggers do seem very dangerous, but I'm not entirely sure to whom. Milady's first attack smashes a dagger, which allows us to see that it really is acid inside as it attempts to dissolve the table, but how close must that get to the user's hand? In addition, glass is not very strong by its very nature, and later on when she's slashing up a pillow because she missed D'Artagnan, I'm caught constantly wondering at what point those daggers are going to break and spill its contents all over Milady. As it happens, this unfortunate event does not occur, and D'Artagnan makes it to his sword, at which point he has her at a considerable disadvantage, although he then manages to drop his sword, having very temporarily trapped her under the bed's awning, and he almost again gets hit by the final dagger as it's flung towards the door as he bravely runs away. Fight 13 occurs as D'Artagnan thinks he's going to rescue his friends and help free them from jail after some minor drinking-based infractions, but in reality he's riding into a trap set by Rochefort. Fortunately, his friends are in fact riding in the opposite direction to meet him.
What did I do?
swordplay? Oh, the devil would fight out of doors this weather. Only a lunatic.
You mean D'Artagnan might be involved?
Who else on this road?
Get him!
This is definitely a fight scene of spectacle rather than technical swordplay. It's more like fencing on ice or ice dance than actual combat, except in ice dance people aren't trying to injure or kill each other. After Rochefort twice tries to kill D'Artagnan from horseback, D'Artagnan falls onto the frozen stream or pond that they're next to, and Rochefort decides to deal with him honourably. Naturally, the fighting is a mess. The Three Musketeers arrive to help deal with the additional ruffians, although D'Artagnan does actually manage to take one out while floating in the water, having broken through the ice. The best sustained piece of swordplay in the entire scene is actually between Aramis and one ruffian, and it's glimpsed partially through the trees. And here we get another glimpse of Aramis's ambitions to become a priest. In Fight 14, all four musketeers are desperately trying to reach Madame Bonacieux to protect her from Milady de Winter.
Only Porthos can invent a new way to disarm himself.
Why does it always happen to be me?
Perhaps you're getting too old, my dear fellow.
In the film, this fight scene is interrupted by scenes inside the nunnery with both Milady and Madame Bonacieux. So I've cut these out in order to merge all of these fight scenes into one continuous fight scene. Overall, it's quite a melee with many assailants and opponents all over the nunnery complex, and our four heroes split up and together at various different points. However, it becomes more focused once Rochefort and Athos meet. This is clearly a meeting of near equals, although possibly Athos has the upper hand, although we'll never know because he is ultimately distracted by another opponent and Rochefort sees his chance and sneaks in a hit, running Athos through. Porthos spends most of his time getting increasingly trapped in the burning section of the nunnery, while Aramis methodically works his way through assailants, pausing only to help Porthos out. However, Porthos has his time to shine when he saves Aramis with the Porthos maneuver. D'Artagnan is energetic as always and all over the battlefield, bouncing off objects and people with wild abandon and energy. However, this expenditure of energy by both the musketeers and Rochefort and the guards will take its toll in the next fight scene. Fight 15 is the final fight and is heart-rending as D'Artagnan has discovered Bonacieux dead and he stumbles shocked out of the monastery only to find Rochefort, who he blames directly for her death.
Gaskell, turn and run.
You murderers!
In this fight, D'Artagnan is furious, grief-stricken, and set solely on revenge. However, both he and Rochefort are exhausted, having been fighting for a considerable time before this latest encounter. In this fight, and perhaps because of their exhaustion, we see again a hitting with the soggy end, where D'Artagnan whacks Rochefort's blade aside using the hilt and handle of his rapier. Near the end of the fight, D'Artagnan, in some weariness-induced error, grabs Rochefort's blade by accident and then has his hand cut in a scene which is eerily reminiscent of the slightly later 1977 film The Duelists, which also had Bill Hobbs as the fight choreographer. Almost at the very end of the fight, D'Artagnan's blade is broken by Rochefort's parrying dagger, an event which echoes and harkens back to their first ever encounter, where Rochefort's thug breaks D'Artagnan's and D'Artagnan's grandfather's blade. However, the missing few inches of the tip of the weapon does not prevent D'Artagnan from thrusting it through Rochefort to end the fight, and for D'Artagnan gain some measure of vengeance for Madame Bonacieux's death. And so we have reached the end of this two-part review of The Three Musketeers and The Four Musketeers, number 1 in the top 10 best sword-fighting films of all time. And I hope you can see through both of these videos, through the cinematography, the acting, the direction, the fight choreography by Bill Hobbs, and as a consequence, the sheer excellence and brilliance of the fights therein, why this has attained the top ranking in my list. Although with the end of this video we also reach the end of the series, this might not be quite the end. I will probably continue the series with an honourable mentions, requests and guilty pleasures addendum. In terms of honourable mentions and requests, the first that springs to mind of course is The Court Jester, which was mentioned by Doomcock as being one of his favourite films, and I will have to watch this and I will do a video in the same vein as this top 10 list looking at the sword fights in that film. As to guilty pleasures, one of the first of those that springs to mind is in fact The Return of the Musketeers, the sequel to the films I've just been reviewing here. It is nowhere near the same standard as these two, and yet I must confess I do enjoy watching it. It is still fun. If anyone has any requests for films they'd like me to look at and possibly review, and I know there have been a few references made in comments in other videos in this series, please can you comment in this video so that I can see which films my viewers would like me to have a look at. Beyond this continuation, I will probably do one more one-off video listing the top 10 sword fights in order in one video, because that should only take one video, I would hope. And beyond that, there is of course my ongoing series of The Marvelous Musical Mayhem and The Doctor Reads the Doctor by the Doctor, which will be continuing shortly, I hope, with brand new material in Season 12. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope you'll join me in the next video, whatever that may be. In the meantime, take care.